to get kick-proof doors and bulletproof glass in somebody's apartment so that it can be a safe house. Maybe that's what we have to do. But it's going to be a lot different than what we would do for situational couple violence and sort of a standard accountability circle approach.
I think I have maybe two follow-up questions. One is that I think one of the things that I thought was, particularly insightful was the way that you talked about those particular cases of intimate terror are often sort of misdiagnosed because people view the perpetrator of the person who will be the perpetrator of the harm as the victim, right? Because they might be in distress, they might be suicidal, they might have, they're generally in crisis, and so people are putting attention towards helping that person without realizing that that person might end up being a danger to the people around them, and so that's sort of a first piece, and then the other piece of my follow-up question would be kind of about the role that, you don't really talk about this in the book, but I know that other abolitionists like Angela Davis have about like the role that media and popular culture plays in our understandings of violence. And I thought about this, a good example is actually the one that you gave about like the flowers and these kind of like warning signs that we often like feel in our bodies, but have trouble articulating. And I think that the kind of only places where we've seen those narratives is often in films and like movies, on television, and we kind of relegate them to this kind of surreal sphere that doesn't have a kind of embodied reality around us, so that when we see it, it's very hard to understand that it's like actually something that people really experience that isn't just like a Law and Order episode kind of thing. And so I wonder how we kind of, as a society make that leap from, in many ways, having some understanding of how these things work from watching TV, but then actually making violence prevention an everyday skill. Like, how do we actually make it a skill that we have as opposed to a kind of set of abstract knowledge and feeling that we carry?
Yeah, so the first part. One of the reasons I wrote this book is a friend of mine killed his girlfriend not too many years ago. And that for me was a perfect and tragic illustration of a need for abolition strategies to account for what happens when the dangerous person is also a danger to themselves and also is a survivor of all kinds of shit that we need to be working on a lot farther upstream. And we're seeing this replicated in the place where I live, the Lionel Desmond tragedy, where Lionel Desmond, he was a Canadian Armed Forces vet who took the life of his wife, his daughter, and his mother in Guysborough County, Nova Scotia. And one of the things that the commission identified is that there was a lot of attention to his mental health and his vulnerabilities as someone who was struggling in such a way that it actually masked all the risk factors for the risks that he posed to his family during that time. And that's where I think, going back to what we were talking about in terms of like, misogyny can't be the end of the conversation, because when we talk about December 6th, we are also talking about someone who took the lives of women, but also took their own life, also was a survivor of severe and brutal violence in the home with a father who was abusive to his mother and to him as a child. So we're also talking about a crime that could have been prevented if we had proper community-based social services and family services that addressed violence, upstream. And so, the situation with my friend who murdered his girlfriend a few years ago was this really difficult experience of, for me personally, was knowing that he was a risk to his partner, but not being believed, because in many cases, the killer is struggling so apparently with their mental health. They appear as if they're a victim of circumstance. They're a victim of racial capitalism in a lot of ways. So like the occupational trauma that happens to a lot of men in trauma-exposed work. I just talked about Lionel Desmond. He was a vet. He saw a lot of horrible violence. He was implicated in state violence, and he was harmed because of that. And so we get in this weird loop of enabling toxic behaviors like stalking, possessiveness, sexual jealousy. We don't want to talk about that because what we're trying to do is actually heal the wounds of the perpetrator. But we do it in a way that enables, because we don't know how to hold these two ideas side by side, which is that often killers are survivors too. And that's where the importance of an abolitionist perspective comes in, because the decolonial feminisms and abolitionist feminisms brought to us by Angela Davis point out that like these binaries are not helpful, because they don't help us get into that uncomfortable position we need to be in when we're like, well, hold up, I think so-and-so might be a risk to themselves. But just really creepy the way they're talking about their partner. And I'm a little bit worried about their partner too. So then how do we deal with that together, especially when it might be a high-risk situation? And intervening could be, risky for us. I'm missing the second half of your question. So the first, media, we were talking about media. Yeah, so the thing that I have learned from working with killers, with folks who have survived sometimes like three and a half decades of incarceration is that, and I also know this because my friend who took the life of his partner was a really nice guy, and like, killers are not monsters. And that's where media comes in, because like Criminal Minds, that show Criminal Minds, like this whole idea of like serial killers being mentally ill, like these deeply stigmatizing narratives about mental illness, portraying anyone who kills as a monster, really puts us back in that binary of thinking like killers must be horrible because homicide is like the ultimate moral transgression. It's the most evil thing you can do. And often this like really scary behavior that folks get into, where they're like surveilling and stalking and like doing things to exert control over their partner, they also do it while they're like super polite to the neighbors, while they might have like really vulnerable body posture. And so, that's where I think we do need to respect frontline expertise, and we do need to pay people to get really good to be the ones that are like the tip of the wedge between that binary, who are like, can feel it in their gut, and they're educated in knowing how the vulnerabilities of a perpetrator or potential killer can be seen alongside the vulnerabilities of the people around them. And so there's like a lot of media that I can't watch and I don't watch, because it enrages me so much. I can't get my cortisol levels like down within 24 hours of watching the type of media that shows that killers are monsters. Because we have people sitting in jail now who have been there for multiple decades, who would do a really good job of helping to lead community initiatives, like working with men who are about to do the things that they were incarcerated for, and after 20 years have some perspective on that. And so I think we need to like disentangle ourselves from this idea that, killers are monsters, so that we can develop ways to make sure that we are looking for accountability by helping killers heal, so that they can be the ones who are helping us do the difficult and dangerous work of intervention.
All right, I have maybe one last question before we open things up. Maybe I'll try to combine two questions before we open things up to the audience. Am I forgetting one of them? Maybe I forgot one of them. All right, the other one was, I guess around, all right, I remember the other one. Great. It was actually in listening to you talk about this, this tragedy that you experienced with a friend of yours killing their partner. And in the beginning of the book, you talk about the kind of sort of complicated, mixed feeling situation that you found yourself in as an abolitionist, but as someone who still found themselves wanting that person to go to jail, to prison. And I know that myself, in teaching about abolition, it's something that I, have always tried to balance, is the reality that, in the context of my classes, it's not generally in the context of homicidal violence, but, even in the context of sexual violence and intimate partner abuse and violence, that, sometimes people have to do what they have to do to protect themselves, to be safe, and they have to, they end up calling the police. And so I wonder, as how you kind of balanced that kind of tension between knowing and understanding that people, can and do call the police, and often it's the only recourse that they have, especially given the kind of portrait, the landscape that we currently live in. But then also being critical of the state and of state responses. So that's the first question. And then the other question would be kind of about the kind of larger abolitionist horizon of working towards ending violence. And because you really explain in the book the extent to which intimate terror, a person who is an intimate terrorist, who is exerting that kind of violence and coercion over their partner, is generally not in a position where they can be held accountable, where they are going to be sort of in a healing journey or anything like that, and yet we have to make considerations for the safety of their partner and the people around them. And so you talk about compassionate containment as something that we may have to think about. And I wonder if compassionate containment is something that is like something that we build on the way towards abolition, or if it's like the abolitionist horizon itself. And so maybe you could explain a little bit more what the compassionate containment is. So that would be my second question. And then we'd probably open it up to the audience.
I have one.
Oh.
You want to answer those questions before?
Okay. Really got to work my short-term memory here. Tick all those boxes. I really wanted my friend to stay in jail forever. And to be honest, like I don't ever want to see him again. And friends of mine are afraid about him getting out of jail. And I would be lying if I didn't say that I am also afraid of that. Especially because I live tweeted his whole trial with feminist commentary, which I'm sure him and his defense lawyer didn't really appreciate. But there's like this quote that Miriam Kaba, and I think someone else helped to write it, but there's this piece, abolition is not your fucking feelings. Like, the way that we feel doesn't always have to determine the directions we need to move in. And sometimes, like, transformations, when I think about transformative justice, I have to recognize, like, transformation requires growth. Growth is hard. Like, you actually, like, tear in those muscle fibers to get bigger and stronger in different ways. And, so when I think about working with survivors, I try to take a harm reduction approach to working with police. So it's like, okay, well, this person has access to firearms. It's a really unsafe situation. We have 3 of us at the kitchen table right now to deal with this, and maybe the survivor believes that police is the best way to go. So we just make sure that we have folks there who know the criminal code and can advocate and can hold the police who show up accountable. And I think that that's important, and some of the ways we can do that is making sure, asking officers, okay, what are you putting in the reporting system? Because if the survivor calls back, if this dangerous person returns to the home tonight, what is the next cop on the next shift going to see in the system? Because if you don't input your notes right away, then you're just going to have a bunch of clueless cops coming and not being helpful and not understanding when an arrest maybe could be made. So I think that's definitely a part of it, and also asking questions can you accompany this person to a secure shelter? Because sometimes, in some cases, shelters will give priority access to folks who are brought in by police. So if you know that in advance, and the survivor knows that they have a better chance of getting a bed in a secure shelter, then maybe that's a way you need to engage with police. But I think that also, as folks who are intervening and working with people who are in dangerous relationships, our safety matters too. And so I think it's really neoliberal sometimes to be only what the survivor wants, because I think we also need to know our own threshold for engaging as bystanders and as interveners to know that when we don't feel safe, and trusting our gut in those circumstances. And that's something I learned about one of the interviews I did for the book, and it didn't make it into this book, it's gonna go in the next one. I interviewed someone in Ivory Tuesday, was working with Bear Clan in Thunder Bay. She talked about, so anyone who hasn't heard about Bear Clan is it's the First Nation approach to community safety on the streets, staffed by volunteers, sometimes paid staff if they got a grant, to do the work of keeping people safe, usually after hours. And Ivory talked about developing those spidey senses and trusting in your gut, knowing when a situation is unsafe, that's part of the work of community safety. And so I think that if we don't feel safe around police, we can walk away. So I think that we have to like keep that in mind too, to like know that we're acting within our values, because if we get ourselves shot, if we get ourselves killed, if we get ourselves a criminal record that's going to impact our ability to like have a secure livelihood, I think that comes at too big of a cost. Yeah. What was the second part of the question?
Compassionate containment.
Right. Yeah, compassionate containment. So that's this idea that I got. I can't take credit for that. I worked with women who were survivors of secure care, forensic psych prisons, and like inpatient psychiatric care with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. So like the prison populations in like Canada, the States, and Europe have extremely high rates of folks who meet like diagnostic criteria for personality disorders. And for women specifically in the women's prison where I worked, like a big cause of having a diagnosis of BPD comes from neglect and invalidation within the family, within the home, within institutions. And so, you know, I worked with them for like 6 or 7 years, and they were really helpful for me in understanding how our abolitionist politics often forget about neglect. We talk a lot about violence. We can see violence. We can see the violence that police are perpetrating in our own communities. We can see that. We can watch it on YouTube, on Facebook Live. But it's harder to see neglect, and it's harder to talk about. But neglect is not only a risk factor for us developing maladaptive ways of coping where we harm each other, but also if you're someone who has been neglected, largely because like neoliberalism is an ethic of neglect. That's what it does. It strips away our social safety net, so we're just like floating out there in the vacuum. Neglect requires that we like pull each other close, and that we draw a bond, that we like set a boundary and make people feel contained. And that's what the folks I chatted with who had been through forms of like inpatient psychiatric care talked about wanting to be admitted to hospitals, wanting to be committed because they wanted that feeling of being contained, because they'd experienced so much neglect within neoliberal society in other ways. And then when I have been in prisons and I've chatted with folks like who are short timing or like close to the end of their sentence, or they're like about to get on a parole, they talk about like the terrifying vastness of the community that exists outside of the prison, and like there is something comforting to being contained and having a family and having a structure and having a schedule. And so those experiences forced me to think about like, okay, there is a role for containment, and you know, to use Marc Lépine as an example, as a young person, long before he got access to a gun and became someone who took the lives of 14 women and took his own life, I think he was a youth who really could have used some compassionate containment, which means a space where he would have been accountable to his own healing, where he would have been able, away from all the harms that he was feeling in society, where he would have been able to heal and put himself within a social group with folks who were struggling in similar ways, with strong, grounded frontline workers who understood what he was going through. And so, you know, this is where we can think about things like community supervision. I think that all consequences like don't have to be seen as like a punitive carceral approach, and this is something like Mariam Kaba is always talking about too. Like not all consequences are punitive, and so if we have aspects of compassionate containment, it also gives us a strategy for working with folks who are dangerous, but also a danger to themselves. And a lot of the men I work with in prison who are there for homicide, they were a risk to themselves in ways that like could have triggered compassionate care and community supervision long before they took the lives of other people and tried to take their own lives. What that would look like, I don't know. I think we gotta have those conversations as communities. We gotta have them together. But I do think that we can put healing and community accountability and community supervision together in ways that are not necessarily carceral.